Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Back to Basics. This is a Southeast Uplift pilot workshop series to provide trainings to enhance your community engagement process in your communities. I'm Macho Williams, neighborhood planner and liaison manager at Southeast Uplift. I'm here with my colleague Alex.
I'm Alex Sharon. I'm the Partnerships and Grant Making Programs Manager at Southeast Uplift.
And tonight we have the honor of being joined by Quincy Brown to provide on honoring the histories and building equity in your planning. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Quincy.
Awesome. Thank you, Machi. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thank you. And then we go to the next one too. Awesome. So hello, everyone. My name is Quincy. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the co-founder of We All Rise, which is a social equity planning firm that focuses on historical redress and phased economic development. We believe that community projects should be moving at the speed of trust. And some of the topics we're going to be discussing today is really how to take some of that trust that we've built intergenerationally and connect that to our civic projects and our civic participation that we're building in our neighborhoods. I am an academic and a planner, so I like to kind of ground myself in this space of kind of sharing what my academic focuses are, which are similar to this presentation. So I focus on the intersection of spatial planning, transgenerational civic engagement, and community development. I have a bachelor's from Claremont McKenna College, and I'm studying right now at UCLA, doing a master's in urban and regional planning. Go to the next slide. So before we start, I just want to first do an acknowledgement and also set some ground rules to how we're going to engage today, and then just really encourage folks to ask questions and critique and push back, because I think that's the best way for us to learn and be in community. So I want to acknowledge that we're on stolen land developed by extractionary-based practices, which really means that we want to honor and respect the Native American traditions that have been in this space since the dawn of time, and also understanding that a lot of folks who are in these spaces or in this community were not chosen to be here, or we're coming here for nefarious reasons. And so we want to make sure that we respect that and honor that as we move forward. This is both a safe space and an academic space, so we want to allow for folks to understand civic engagement in both an emotionally safe environment, but also one where we're going to be learning. So I really encourage folks to challenge, question, and respect the diversity of opinion and viewpoints that come to the space. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold real quick, so I'm going to be coughing for a second. I'm going to take one. Thank you. So the objectives today are: one, to deepen understanding on how our historical information can inform, guide, and enhance our community projects. Two, build authentic connections to our ancestral past and current day civic initiatives. Three, understand our positionality by examining our motivations for civic engagement. So first, just want to start with a basic question and understanding what is an historical lens. And so I'm going to pass that off to Machu, and maybe you can kind of provide a little statement on what you think a historical lens is.
Absolutely. So, historical lens, to me would be looking at the past so that you're aware of like how we got to where we are today. So you can make an informed choice that about how to go into the future and what to bring with you and what to leave behind, perhaps.
Yeah, that's great. Alex, do you want to share, or no pressure?
Sure. Historical lens. It's pretty much what Machi said. As you look to the future, you just want to keep an eye on the past and see how it lines up, and let the history inform you how to move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so all those points are spot on. And so I've just kind of listed some things to consider when we think about historical lens and kind of understanding why history matters. So in historical planning and understanding historical contexts through community engagement and planning, there's both a metaphysical and spatial element. And so the metaphysical element is really the understanding of the social interactions that we have, often called socialization. So it's how we're socialized to think about instances of history, policy decisions or planning decisions that have happened. It often is kind of thought about as kind of the stories that we tell, the memories that we keep, or the information that we pass on to generations that maybe isn't physical. There's also the spatial element, which refers to the design and built environment decisions which have influenced our way of life. So from the metaphysical decisions and socialization that we've been able to have, we now have our physical environment that is the way that it is based off those decisions. So it's really important to understand those two elements of historical lens planning and kind of how that is manifested when you are doing community engagement events. Secondarily, you have understanding the context and understanding production of history. The production the production of history really just means how is it developed, who's telling the stories, and how is that produced with the power dynamics that we know to be true in history. So understanding how those power dynamics maybe uplift the winners of those histories and devalue the losers, and what that means in terms of how we discuss historical policy decisions and planning activities that have influenced how we live today. And then lastly, in historical lens planning, it's really important that we honor our ancestors, both the positive and negative aspects of our ancestors, and be able to bring those kind of family stories, those spatial ancestors into this place to be able to really understand those ideas that they left us, or those ideas that we want to leave in the past. And before I start kind of moving on through the next part of the presentation, I want to have a disclaimer. I know that for some folks that are on this call, talking about familial posts past can be challenging or triggering. So please feel free to take the necessary precautions to take care of yourself emotionally during this presentation. And please refrain from participating if you feel that participating might trigger you. And don't feel free to reach out on the chat if you have any questions or concerns privately to me. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and I'm super happy to answer any questions privately or console if there's any challenges or issues throughout the presentation. And please feel free to ask questions or push back or critique any aspects that I'm sharing. Feel free to pass on.
Thank you, Quincy. And you mentioned like production of history, so,
Mhm.
and just like who may not whose narrative might be missing or not part of the canon, if you will. So thank you for centering that.
Yeah, no worries. So how do we develop our historical lens? So this will be the first activity that we do have. So we have a small group today, so we won't spend too much time on this, but so given the working definition that we've just been able to brainstorm, let's talk about some ways to develop a historical lens. After everyone has had time, we'll hear from 3 participants or 2 from this information, and we will develop some working steps into developing a historical lens. So I'll give you some time to think, give you maybe 2 minutes to think, and then feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat if you'd like to share your thoughts on how we develop our historical lens. And I'll share first just to give some folks some ideas, and then we'll hear from 2 participants, and then we'll go from there. So one activity that I did when I was first kind of coming to civic engagement work early in undergrad was I did a family history analysis. So I went back to my mom's side of the family and went back multitudes of generations to understand what my family was doing during these times, for example, during post-slavery, during the Great Depression, and like what were the kind of social situations there? What was the family doing? How was it being developed? And what were there any things I could learn from my familial ancestors? And one thing that was really interesting to learn about was the pathway in which my mom's side of the family was able to migrate from Alabama to Albina. And it was very interesting because my great grandfather was a farmer and owned a small piece of property that he built a small home on and was able to rent that home out to another Black family and then work together on that farm to cultivate the land and sell the vegetables and fruits at a farmer's market. And that was really institutional for both those families to be able to migrate to the Northwest. And so I'm really passionate about creating urban gardens and kind of in the city space, having that similar kind of mindset of like how to use the land as a way to bring food and also be able to bring resources to my community. So it was really cool to be able to hear that story from my grandmother about her grandpa, and how that was kind of institutional into her being able to come from out Alabama to Albina. So I'll give that. And then if anyone else wants to share on their point, pass it off the mic.
Thanks, Quincy. And such a great thing to know why we are where we are today. I think like for me personally, it was just, economic opportunity, familial connections. Like for example, with my mother's parents, they had left, or her mother, I should say, had left upstate Minnesota. A lot of the family lived on reservations, some lived off, and some of the family had moved out here to seek economic opportunity around the Second World War. But think about that context, the reservations weren't getting much support. There was a whole lot of opportunity. And like a lot of Pacific Coast cities, there was opportunity and new development investment here along the coast. And so, when they moved out here in the 40s, I think the thing they said was they really enjoyed was just like the lack of snow, having come from, the Great Lakes, Canada area. And so that just helps me understand why they left where they did, what was happening to that part of the family broadly, both in Canada and the United States at the time, and the opportunity they saw given the circumstances. So it just helps you understand why things happened, why we are here today.
Can I ask a follow-up question about you?
Yeah.
How do you think that story has influenced your positionality as a neighborhood planner?
I think there's a lot of unrecognized stories that happen, and the development patterns happen for a reason. And so people move based on opportunity and affordability, and this happens in like areas throughout the city. So yeah, the economic and social factors is, and racial too, are really important in how our neighborhoods develop and when they develop and where they develop.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Anyone else want to share? No pressure. We can also kind of talk about the idea of historical lens planning too.
I think we should talk about the idea of historical lens.
Sounds good. Awesome. So, pretty much what Machu shared and what I shared gives a really good context of how to develop your historical lens, and it really does center on first understanding your own familial stories. And like I said, I know that for some folks having their own personal family challenges and triggers, it may not be the best to start from there. So I also would suggest looking at the spatial ancestors that we have. So realizing that we're in Portland and there's a lot of really cool people that we'll talk about later that have been able to support Portland in its development as a city that it is today. So being able to connect to those folks too, and like really understanding how our ancestors, our community members who lived before us, were able to make decisions, and they're given their context and given their daily lives, and how those decisions now affect our ability to bike, our ability to drive our cars, our ability to house ourselves. And so that's really what historical lens planning is. It really starts from doing the research and then and diving into the history that we have in our urban space, and personifying that and actually finding something that we both care about and that we're interested in, that we have some type of connection to. Building that connection where either it becomes something that you're really passionate about the housing history, you're super passionate about transportation history, land use history, anything really. It's really important to kind of start with that passion, understand that passion through the lens of its past day, and then being able to bring those decisions that were made and contextualize how that is now manifesting in its current day. So, for example, the information that I shared was really kind of, I was able to understand the migration of Black individuals from the South to Portland, and understanding kind of the mechanisms and tools that my family was able to use during that time. And then understanding, in the 40s and 50s, as my family was migrating to um, Portland, really understanding the kind of social and economic spaces that they were coming to and the opportunities that they had in difference to the South that they were coming from. Similar to Machu, shared a very similar story and kind of the juxtaposition between the Pacific Northwest and the reservation communities within the Great Lakes area. So it's, once we're starting to be able to develop that cultural understanding of our history, it's really easy for us to start now thinking about how decisions have context, and often that context maybe is coming from years and years ago. But once we have that context, it's a lot easier for us to understand those decisions and start to unpack them and see if those are decisions that we want to bring into the future. Feel free to go to the next slide. So now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through a brief history of Southeast Portland. It's going to be brief, and I'm sure that most folks have either interacted with this information before, and if they haven't, I will hopefully be a good history lesson, but we're going to kind of decontextualize and deconstruct Southeast Portland as a way for us to then move forward and start to understand what are those avenues and pathways for us to start engaging civically so that we can address some of the historical wrongs that we have created, but also bring in some of those tools that our ancestors used in the past. And so on the right side of the presentation, there are two photos. The top photo is a painting illustration of the Willamette River Valley, which would have been originally the area of Southeast Portland. And so that picture is really centered on what the Willamette River Valley looked like before settler colonialism and colonization of this area. And so you can see that the Willamette River had a very different pathway than it has today. And I think that's super important to note. It was not like a straight river through the city. It was moving through kind of like a normal river would. There were creeks, there were divots, there were a bunch of different riparian ecosystems that existed around the rivers. And so as you can see, this photo below is actually from the late 1800s. That changed very quickly, and Portland became one of the industrial cities and centers of the West. And that was really in response to the navigability of the Willamette River, as well as the Columbia River, and also kind of this idea of manifest destiny, which is this kind of 1850s idea that the US has the ability to be a country that stems from the East Coast to the West Coast. But before that, there were many, many Native American communities, diverse communities that were coming to the Willamette River Valley to, one, cultivate the land and protect the water sources, the salmon, and all the other natural resources that were available in the area, but also trade with each other from different regions around Oregon and Washington and bring those resources that were not being able to be found by different Native American communities to the Willamette River Valley to be able to have that cross-cultural trading. So the Willamette River Valley has always been seen and continues to this day to be seen as a way to trade and kind of share resources and provide for other communities. So the Lewis and Clark expedition created the Oregon Trail, which directly related to the vast removal of both Native American people and the practices that they had on the land. And so this 1850s photo kind of shows the first range of that settler colonialism practice. This was happening in both coercive and violent ways. It led to a treaty on both the state and federal level, which forced Native Americans to leave their land for reservations. This is like I said, it was rooted in the idea of manifest destiny, and was also connected to the ending of slavery. And so, with the ending of slavery, the cotton economy in the South slowly died, and so it was not productive for anymore for the South to kind of continue on that road. And so, a lot of folks who originally were enslaved or were working on these cotton plantations were now looking for new work opportunities, and those opportunities weren't necessarily available in their communities. And so that really led to this great migration of folks coming from the South and other parts of the US to the Pacific Northwest in the name of Industrial Revolution. And so there are a lot of key figures that are really important for the Industrial Revolution, but one in particular, which is John McLaughlin. So we're going to talk about him a little bit later, but he's a really good example of kind of the manifest destiny industrial revolution that happened in this area, particularly within Southeast Portland, and kind of how that development um, continued throughout the 18th, 19th century. So with the increased industrialization of the Willamette River, the Central East Side was born. And that was connecting with other future developments in the kind of the port side of the city that was being developed in Northwest and North Portland and build this industrial port city. There was a lot of housing that was constructed, which is making up the inner Northeast neighborhood. So a lot of the homes that were built in the 1890s to the 1910s were specifically for the workforce needs that were being developed in the Central East Side because of the growth of agricultural resources of timber and salmon production. So as industrialization continued, wealth flowed to create the streetcar suburbs to then fill in the inner East Side. So in the 1920s developments that we see kind of in Ladd's Addition, we see in Laurelhurst, we see in Mount Tabor, came kind of after the first round of industrial revolution and the resources and flowing of the kind of growing Oregon economy was able to like kind of provide the reason to build Ladd Addition, Laurelhurst, Mount Tabor, and the Hawthorne streetcar. So that kind of first step in industrial revolution all the way into the early 1930s is what drove the development of our Central East Side and the outer and inner Southeast neighborhoods. So Dr. McLaughlin is a great example of all of this kind of deconstructive history of both the Native American removal and the influx of white settlers into the area. So he was a doctor and a fur trader who was sent by the Hudson Company to come and create a Columbia version of the Hudson Company. The goal was to decrease the dependency on in imports in Europe, so AKA drive up the industrial capacity for Oregon. And he was able to launch Oregon's main industrial activities, so agriculture, timber, and salmon. And he made claims and expanded the land that is now considered McLaughlin Boulevard. So a lot of the area that is in Southeast Portland was really developed kind of in the name of this industrial revolution and also kind of his practices. The Depression era changed the way in which housing was developed, and that's why we see a lot of our multifamily smaller homes. That also was triggered by the war, and so the war, World War II, was allowing for a lot of the building codes to be relaxed. There was a need for duplexes and triplexes, as we needed to house people during the war, and so a lot of the homes that we see that maybe have a 1920s or a 1910 style, but are maybe now duplexes in that area was that first step was happening during the war. And then after the war, there was this industrial capacity that was built up for the city and for the country. And so those laws were taken back in the name of building more housing. And so that's where you get a lot of the 1940s housing developments that are more outer east side and outer southeast Portland that were also workforce housing kind of in that last development process. And so as kind of that process was happening, the war ended. We had this moment of civil rights activism that led to actually, could you just go to the next slide? Awesome. So yeah, as the war ended, there was an industrial shift and economic development was changing. And so this created an imbalance on race and class lines. A lot of these neighborhoods were zoned for specific populations to be able to be there. Redlining is the term that is used for the zoning that was happening during that time, which created these imbalances on race and class lines. And so this triggered a lot of 1950s and 1960s activism, specifically on addressing these challenges around housing, on transportation, on community development. And while this activism was wildly successful, both statewide and national, it did trigger a lot of suburban flight that was coupled by the development of inner city freeways that were considered urban renewal projects. On the left side, you can see the urban renewal project that happened through the center of the Central East Side with the goal to get products and people from the Central East Side out to the areas like Gresham that was being developed more, Beaverton, and Vancouver that had their own industrial practices. And so as that happened, people started leaving the city, and in that kind of moving away, there was a lot of effort into revitalizing and greening the space. And so that a lot of projects happened during that period of time. Hawthorne saw one of the first urban renewal districts in the country, and it started to kind of drive up the economic development in the space. More people started moving back into the area, and it caused a lot of displacement. And so now, in our kind of modern day civic engagement, all of these different elements are starting to come into play. We have suburban flight, we have urban renewal, we have potential crisis situations, we have displacement. So we're at a very interesting crossing points today, where a lot of these different elements of the past are all coming to fruition and creating the community that we are in today. So it's really important to kind of understand those different elements of history as it relates to the spaces that we're in, because not only does it tell us a story about the different architectural decisions, the land use decisions, and why neighborhoods in our neighborhood look the way that they do, but it also gives us a context and understanding how those decisions were made, what were the effects of those decisions, and how can we either redress or continue those decisions on to today. Any questions about that history?
A lot of this, was done in the name of urban renewal. But I think you were getting at the point, right, to stimulate economic activity, benefit the power structure, at the expense of those that weren't aligned with it.
Yeah, it's really like it's super interesting. As I was preparing this presentation, the similarities between World War One and World War Two are very striking when it comes to urban renewal and investment, where you have a lot of um, capacity being built because of the war, and then policies changing because there's all this capacity and nothing to do with it. And so those policies change to allow for that capacity to be redirected into domestic policies and domestic activity. And so those two kind of post-war planning in both World War II and World War One are super influential on how we see our cities, because those are the two like main inflection points that we have kind of in early Portland that really changed the makeup and the policies of how we plan. I mean, I know folks are really familiar with this, but we just ended the regulation around single family zoning, but during the late 40s and early 50s, it was actually legal to do a lot of this stuff, and it was because they needed the workforce housing and they needed people to give up their homes to support the war effort. But the second the war ended and the capacity was that needed to be redirected, it started being redirected in the freeway developments and the new workforce housing in outer Southeast and the suburbanization that was happening in outside of Southeast and outside of East Portland and also outside of West Portland. So um, it's important to see those kind of ebbs and flows of history, because that's kind of the ebbs and flows of history that we're going to see in the future. So understanding kind of how those dynamics come into play will help us understand, in our current day crisis situations, how those policies might change as things shift. So
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with climate change and sea level rising, how that might shift human populations around.
exactly. I mean, I think we're seeing a third migration in the Northwest from places like California and Texas that are just becoming too hot to live, and are dealing with a lot of the externalities of climate change a lot more rapidly. And so I think because our ecosystem is one of the older ecosystems in the US, we're going to see a lot of that migration because it's one of the safer places to be during an environmental crisis. And we saw that deep in the 1700s and, on and on into a millennia.
Super interesting.
So now, similar to kind of what we did to identify how we build our historical lens, we're now going to kind of talk about understanding our ancestral past. And so now that we've kind of decontextualized the urban history that is Southeast, but is also very similar to most West Coast and post war cities, uh, we're going to kind of talk about our own family histories and try to kind of understand a little bit more about how we can explore those ancestral past situations and how we can learn from those situations and then start bringing that information into addressing the challenges. And so I'm gonna point to the photo at the bottom because I think that's one that is really similar to my growing up experience, but then also very similar to my uncle who's pictured in this photo. As you can see, this is a photo of, it's kind of hard to see, but it's a photo of the 1960s. My uncle and my mom and my aunt were some of the first kids to be bused in the 60s from their predominantly black school to white school. And so, as you can see, they were one of the only people of color in their school situation. And this is happening when they were around 7 or 8. And it's similar to my situation because I grew up in Laurelhurst and I was one of the only black individuals in my classes as well. And it's interesting, and I share this because both situations, my grandmother in the situation wanted to get better opportunities for their kids. They were being told that the better opportunities were at schools in different neighborhoods. And so they submitted to kind of the policies and said, let's bus our kids to these different schools. And my parents and my uncle and aunts had a pretty bad experience, frankly, at these schools and were bullied because they were the only and marginalized in a different way than they were marginalized in a societal way because they were the only. And I feel like I had a very similar experience in my situation as well. And I share that because I think that we sometimes think that as history changes, the things are different, but they really do go in these cycles. And I found it so interesting as I was doing this research that my the experience that my aunts and uncles had in the 60s was still very similar to the experience that I had in the early 2000s. And that's 40 years away. And so a lot of the kind of questions I was asking myself as a young person was, one, why was this happening? Two, like, why did my parents choose this neighborhood over a neighborhood that would be maybe more diverse? And then three, like, what were the ways in which I can influence the neighborhood, given my positionality and kind of understanding? So it got me really interested in education, got me really interested in kind of special education and kind of the diversity that's in education. And it got me really interested in understanding how people move through space and how we move people to resources instead of providing resources to their communities. So, sorry. What we're gonna do now is, we're gonna kind of, on our own, explore our own ancestral past. So, with these guiding questions of, how can we learn from our ancestors? What elements do we want to bring to the present? What elements do we want to leave in the past, and how can these stories help us better connect and serve our community? So I'll give you some time to think, and then we can share in the next 2 minutes. All right. Now that everyone's had a couple minutes to think, does anyone want to take a crack at any of these questions?
I'll get started. How can we learn from our ancestors? I, for one, think that's a tough lesson to learn. We live under different circumstances and not the same ones. But I think one of the things we can learn is how they survived in the circumstances they were in. Understanding that and applying it to our situation, and hopefully honing in on some of the resilience that it took for them to survive in the situations they were in. Elements I want to bring to the present. Well, like I was saying before, that resilience, being the first, Black students to be integrated into white schools, or being the first Black residents in a neighborhood that's experiencing white flight, or just anything like that, brings with it a sense of otherness. And how do you deal with that? How do you experience that? It's a lot more extreme than, I would say, the past is a lot more extreme than today, in a lot of ways. And so, it's like going to your grandmother and asking her, how did you do it? And finding out from her that it wasn't easy for her, but or she's built from stronger stock than you are. Sometimes you're just like, wow, you're so much more resilient than I could ever be. And what elements do you want to leave in the past? I think there's a lot of generational trauma that comes from that kind of resilience. I don't think that resilience is like a clean process. I think that it brings a lot of brings a lot out of you to do it. So wherever that comes from is kind of how that resilience is built. So for example, I think that like spanking is a form of is a form that our ancestors took to bold themselves to deal with a world that was brutal. I don't think it belongs today, How can these stories help us better connect and serve our communities? Well, just with that example, I think that we have a possibility to glean from the past and say, well, this was positive, this was not, and apply those lessons today. Yeah, I think that's my answers to those questions.
Yeah, that's really good. If it's okay with you, I'm gonna touch on some of the stuff. But I think, yeah, like you mentioned intergenerational problem solving. And that's like really what I was hoping folks would bring up, is that we have folks that are still here that have experienced very traumatic things, that were able to be resilient in those spaces. And I feel like, and please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but that we're hesitant in this day and age to reach out to our elders, to reach out to our grandparents, and ask them those questions and try to understand how they were able to use their problem solving skills, their spiritual intelligence, or whatever tool they had in that space to be resilient, to bring those tools into our space, but also to kind of have that intergenerational collaboration to move forward so that we can create a place that's going to be, better for the next generation or the next generations. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think also it's important to think about how trauma presents itself, and kind of what was the need for something like spanking in a space like the 60s, when a lot of it was corrective and a lot of it was necessary so that children wouldn't get abused by the racial dynamics that existed in the space. And I agree with you today that like we're not in the same intensity that we were maybe when my parents were in Portland, or my grandparents were like coming into the space. And so it's important to understand kind of why those things were necessary, but then also why we don't need them today. But there's, and kind of to honor that there has been that progress, and that we don't need the same tools that have caused trauma today, but there still can be kind of that ability to understand and problem solve, supporting with folks who have experienced it before. Does anyone else want to share? No worries if not.
I mean, I could share my brief answers to questions. Like, I always find like how navigate life, or like life lessons and skills. Like you said, like our grandparents are invaluable, and just have the know-how because they made it through those times. like my grandmother grew up in the Great Depression, so asking her how to mend clothing and just not rely on just buying new clothing, just amazing skill sets, and other creative reuse solutions. That are really important to the world today. So that's the things I would want to bring is like their reasons for like why they did what they did, the knowledge, the skills, that grit, if you will, the kind of resilience, and like their story. It's important to document that and know where we come from and know how our communities develop or neighborhoods, why they did. But what do I want to leave in the past? I would just say suffering, right? Like maybe that's a fact of life, but just because maybe I had to go through something painful doesn't mean I think the next person after me should have to too. I would think that'd be a growth and learning opportunity in how we build our communities and navigate this life. Is like we don't need to repeat our trauma onto others. Hopefully, that's something, a cycle we can break and remedy and reparations, do all of the above. But these stories connect us to help us understand why we're here, in the challenges like communities face today, in the past, and navigating to the future. And so I just think just these serious questions really connects to how important that family history is, or like even your neighbor's history or your community's history. Just so you understand, like, where we come from and what we can do and what the opportunities are and what needs to be redressed.
Yeah, I really like the point about alleviating suffering and not passing that on to the next generation. Because I think that that's something that and I think it's definitely changing, but there's definitely sometimes a perception that if I experience this, you have to go through it too to get there. And I think that can be a little bit regressive, especially if it's in a situation where it's coming from a space of negativity. And I feel, or power dynamics, or class and race dynamics. And so a lot of those kind of stepping stones that we see as to be these stepping stones are actually coming from these places of suffering. And so I think for me as a community member in Southeast Portland, it's really important to understand where we can undo those stepping stones and create new pathways to leadership and engagement that are empowering to folks, and that give them a purpose and a why, that doesn't make them feel othered and doesn't make them feel that they have to be super resilient to be able to move through and do this work. Because at the end of the day, civic engagement and participation should be something that's empowering and life-giving, and positive, and it shouldn't be something that we are challenged with or afraid to do or afraid of the repercussions of what'll happen if we do it. So I think the whole kind of next step in kind of our continuation as a city and as a state and a country is really going to be figuring out how we can alleviate that suffering and support each other as a community. Awesome. So this really connects to what everyone was just sharing. And so what I like to do is just when we have conversations like this, also connect it back to the policies. Oh, could you go back to, yes. Connect back to the policies that exist in the place that are mandating us to have some of these conversations at the city, state, and federal level. So the policy that is really influential right now to understanding the historical lens planning and how it's going to be activated in our land use policies is the climate-friendly and equitable communities rulemaking that's coming from the Department of Land Use Conservation. And so this policy is pretty much the center of this research, but it really talks about how we need to document and research and provide the historical stories and decisions and information of marginalized communities that have maybe not experienced climate-friendly or equitable communities. So DLDC qualifies this as a full range of different individuals, individuals that are class diverse, that are race diverse, that are gender diverse, that are age diverse. It really is an encompassing community of people when it talks about kind of how we tell these stories. So as mantra you brought up, actually, I think when we were starting this conversation, is just how do we address the fact that so many stories and so many people have been left out of conversations? And this has driven us to the situation that we're in today. And so the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking really attempts to do this. And, at this point in time, understanding that we lack the data, we lack the stories, we lack the historical reports of so many community members because of the way that we were producing history. And so now our planning activities have this opportunity to reproduce some of that history and guide our projects to realizing the new impacts that we can understand. So, for example, I'm working on a TSP, Transportation System Plan update for the city of Milwaukee, which one of our neighborhoods is partially in. And it's one of the first TSP updates that's really reflecting on the historical decisions that were made by the city of Milwaukee, and relating kind of the Native American traditional history of the space, the Industrial Revolution that happened in that space, particularly with the mill development and the railroad developments, and then understanding how kind of the land use decisions around single-family homes, the density of commercial spaces, all come together in that history that leads us into how we develop our transportation networks. Because realistically, we're in a space with all these different dynamics happening. And so it's important for us to realize those dynamics and where they're coming from as we try to create new spaces and new transportation activities. So that's really the impact of this new rule on civic engagement is it kind of creates that mandate at the state level, which requires us to think about these things and have these conversations so that we can ensure that we are respecting the folks who have not been able to be at the table and beginning to honor their past and honor their presence, and ensure that we can move forward and actually include them in these processes. So one of the spotlights I'd like to focus on is from my community, the Laurelhurst Neighborhood Association's community outreach in 2020. So I know many folks are familiar with the different activities, protests, challenges, new developments that happened throughout 2020. But I would like to share a little bit information from our neighborhood association. During 2020, we developed a racial equity initiative that interviewed and worked with the neighborhood. We wanted to understand our neighborhood's opinions on racial equity, of racial covenants, of a lot of the conversations that we're having in Portland, but also at a national level. We also wanted to have this conversation as a neighborhood because we knew that our neighborhood had a place in that space and had a very, a very interesting dynamic going on, frankly. And so what we did is we had a number of conversations at the neighborhood level. We invited folks from the neighborhood to have those conversations and really brainstorm how we would have this initiative be developed. We then released a survey, which we passed out to all the homes and was available by email for 2 weeks, which asked questions about people's opinions. Do they want to make a statement? Do they not want to make a statement? How do they feel comfortable in the neighborhood? Do they feel that there was racial challenges happening in the neighborhood? What was their opinions on that? And so we got, I think, like 65% participation. It was a very high participation rate. We then had a joint conversation. We then brought in an outside facilitator. We then had 3 workshops happening in Laurelhurst Park, and that all culminated into our history of racial restrictive deed covenants in Laurelhurst, and our initiatives to kind of continue. So this is just a screenshot of the website. So if you want to learn more about that, feel free to visit the Laurelhurst Neighborhood Association's website. But we were able to develop a whole historical report on these racial covenants and understand how they were contextualized in our neighborhood and really actually come together as a neighborhood and see all the diversity. I think there was a perception, and I'm not going to say that Laurelhurst isn't a predominantly white neighborhood, but I think there was a perception that there was only white individuals in our neighborhood. But it was really awesome to see how this initiative was able to get folks who did not traditionally engage with the neighborhood association really passionate about the neighborhood association, and the engagement that's continued in the neighborhood association has totally shifted from 2020 to 2024. The dynamics of the neighborhood association, the membership of the neighborhood association and just people being interested in wanting to learn more about what's going on. So it was really interesting to see kind of how history and engagement could come together and allow for our community to actually be able to have these conversations in a space that we probably would have never really had these conversations, and be able to share our individual experiences in the neighborhood and just be better neighbors. Um, so that's example of many different examples that have happened in Southeast Portland, of really our neighborhoods being able to connect our history, engage with each other, support each other, and come up with an initiative that is representation of the communities that we are in. So
I just love that broad participation from the whole neighborhood, and just let them tell their own story or experience.
awesome. So this is kind of the open-end conversation. So I just wanted to bring up the three main points and objectives that we had for the um, workshop, and then just kind of ask this final question. And then as folks think about this final question, try to think about the three objectives. And one, see if you feel like you've gotten that information from this workshop, and then see if you can kind of take those three objectives and kind of develop a working thesis to answer this question. So, um, just to review the objectives again, we have deepening understanding on how historical information can inform, guide, and enhance our community projects, build authentic connections to our ancestral path and current day civic initiatives, understand our positionality by examining our motivations for civic engagement. And so the question is, how can our collective history help us better connect and find commonality within our community? No need to answer right now. I'm going to give you guys some time to think on this, and then feel free to unmute yourself when you are ready.
I think one thing you've really highlighted, Quincy, is just the broader economic and social, legal, racial processes in play, and like how that has motivated or influenced movement of people to new locations, like spatially, and the redlining of neighborhoods, like where people could even legally own property or were encouraged to at the very least, if not outright barred from owning property or the access to resources to own said property. So I think seeing that greater perspective, both in our history and collectively, really helps us to contextualize like the development patterns and like the legacies that we are experiencing in our daily lives, and gives us an opportunity really to pause though and say, like, what are we doing to stop that from continuing forward? How are we making the outcomes or the process ensuring that the outcomes don't repeat that, and like centering whatever may need to be redressed or acknowledged, or what's the collective need of like us as just like a people, like where are the disparities and how can we acknowledge those, and what's the strategy for make sure that everyone has access to opportunity and people aren't continuing to be left out. Kind of really comes home to me, and that, like I said, requires looking at your past, looking beyond yourself and listening to others, and even it's that not individuals, it could be individuals, it's an important part of the process, but listening to like the broader patterns, economic and whatnot in our society, I think is really key, looking beyond ourselves. And like you said, the motivation why you do it is if it's a disrupt intergenerational trauma, then go forth and leave with that.
Yeah, I liked what you said, Machu. It really, I see a weave kind of in your original statement of kind of like your family's migration to um like the Northwest for opportunity, and then your motivation to create opportunity for other folks. So I think that was kind of the point of the presentation, is starting to get kind of these weaves and these kind of points and nodes built within our own personal stories so that we can start kind of like empowering ourselves to know that we are kind of like of our family and of our spatial ancestors that are in these spaces. And a lot of us are coming to these things because the people that we researched and know came to these things with the same questions. And so although history, it's ever changing and we're in the present, it's a very different space. There's a lot of similarity in those initiatives. And for me, I think that's how we really find commonality. It's in that connecting with the older generation, with the younger generations, that and seeing those kind of lines of similarities and being able to work together to create a community that is of all of us and for all of us.